Welcome to Fulcrum Intel Digest, the podcast.
If you've been keeping an eye on global flashpoints, well, you've probably seen this massive geopolitical shift happening right across the heart of Africa.
We're talking about the Sahel, yeah. That huge arid strip just south of the Sahara.
Exactly. And it's a region that's really aggressively trying to redefine its ties with the rest of the world. We've seen coups, mass protests, particularly against former security partners.
Oh, absolutely. It's fair to call the Sahel, one of the most politically charged, externally influenced zones on the continent right now.
And we're talking a huge area here, right? Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, even parts of Sudan.
A vast region. And for years, the dominant narrative was external intervention, wasn't it? Mostly French forces, supposedly there to bring stability.
Right, but the big story lately is this really decisive pushback against that whole model. Military takeovers in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger.
And fueled by this powerful anti-foreign sentiment, specifically anti-French, that seems to be coming from the ground up.
But the big question is, why? What's driving this rejection?
Well, that's exactly what we want to unpack today in this deep dive.
We cover more topics like this every Monday and Friday. So if you'd like to stay up to date, click the subscribe button and give this video a like. Now let's jump in.
We've been looking at some critical research authored by research fellow Jamaldin Oluwasegun Akanbi.
Okay.
And he makes a really compelling case. Essentially, he argues that these externally driven security approaches, they haven't just failed to fix the instability. They've actually made things worse. They've deepened those internal problems, those structural weaknesses, and created this cycle of dependence that just keeps feeding itself.
So it's not just about the internal issues like poverty or governance, which are obviously huge factors.
No, the argument is that foreign intervention played this decisive shaping role in actually accelerating the crisis.
So the intervention itself, maybe unintentionally, ended up undermining the very states it was meant to protect. Is that the core idea?
That's the crux of it. And our goal for you listening is to get a much deeper, more, let's say, nuanced view of this failure.
Okay.
We need to shift away from seeing the Sahel just through that narrow counterterrorism lens, the one that dominated policy for so long.
Right, the global war on terror frame.
Exactly. Instead, we need to look at how foreign involvement, by prioritizing military action above all else, kind of inadvertently weakened these countries, undermine their sovereignty, and maybe even hasten the collapse of legitimate governance.
Right, so let's start right at the beginning, because the source material argues pretty strongly that before you even get to the soldiers and the politics, you have to look at the environment.
Yes, absolutely. Environmental degradation is presented as this fundamental, foundational driver of insecurity. It's often overlooked, but it's critical.
The silent crisis, you could call it. The thing that sort of cracked the foundation first.
That's a good way to put it, because when outside actors come in, they often see the surface problem. They're armed groups, right? And they tend to skip over these deep, grinding ecological pressures that actually make it possible for those groups to recruit and operate in the first place.
So what are we talking about specifically? Desertification.
We're talking about really severe climate variability.
Yeah, desertification pushing south, relentless droughts, rainfall patterns that are just completely erratic.
And I imagine in largely agrarian societies, that translates directly into conflict over resources.
Directly, intense scarcity of the essentials, water and usable land. When those become scarce, conflict isn't just possible, it's almost inevitable.
Okay, so scarcity drives conflict between who?
It dramatically ramps up the tension in these long-standing, often cyclical clashes between different groups who depend on the land.
Like pastoralists and farmers.
Exactly that conflict. Pastoralists need grazing land. Their traditional routes are shrinking because of the desert or being blocked by farms. Farmers, meanwhile, are desperate to protect the little they can grow from migrating herds.
So climate change fuels local conflict. What does that do to the institutions, the way society is organized? Well, this is where it gets really interesting, institutionally speaking. This competition, it shreds the social fabric. Akanbi points out that these escalating local clashes, they actually destroy the traditional ways communities use to resolve disputes peacefully.
The old systems break down.
They break down. And maybe even more importantly, it exposes just how weak the formal local governance structures are. They can't enforce land use rules, they can't deliver justice effectively, they can't mediate these life or death disputes.
Okay, so you've got a governance vacuum. The state can't cope with a climate crisis it didn't create. And this is the gap that external actors stepped into.
Precisely. But here's the key framing issue. They didn't primarily see it as a zone of, say, climate vulnerability or governance collapse.
They saw it as.
They framed it as a frontier of global insecurity, a potential launch pad for terrorism reaching Europe, or a source of migration flows.
Let's pause on that, the securitized framing. That sounds like a really pivotal moment. What did that mean on the ground?
It was hugely consequential because that framing dictated the entire international response. If the core problem is defined as global insecurity, well, the solution that follows logically is military.
Right. Counterterrorism, border security, surveillance.
Drones, intelligence sharing, training local forces for combat. But the fundamental issue, according to the source, is that this diagnosis focused entirely on the symptoms, the fighters, the immediate threat.
While ignoring the root causes.
Yeah.
The desperation, the lack of justice, the failing state.
Exactly. It ignored what was actually driving people to those groups.
Can you give a concrete example of how this played out in terms of, say, funding or resource allocation?
Sure. It led directly to what you could call the militarization of development aid. Huge sums of money flowed into security initiatives like the G5 Sahel Joint Force.
Okay.
Billions spent on military hardware, advanced surveillance tech, tactical training for soldiers. But what about the other side of the coin?
What about things like water management or helping farmers adapt or funding local courts?
Chronically underfunded or just completely ignored in many cases. Those sustainable local solutions just weren't seen as part of the security picture, even though they address the underlying drivers of conflict.
But hold on, isn't there an argument, and we heard this a lot, that you have to secure an area first? You can't build a school or dig a well if insurgents are running rampant. Security first, then development.
That was definitely the dominant argument from external partners, yes. But this research really pushes back hard against that idea.
How so?
It argues that by relying almost exclusively on the military lever, they cemented a specific set of priorities. Narrow security goals, protecting capitals, maybe stopping attacks, completely overshadowed broader human security.
So people on the ground saw foreign troops, maybe saw their own army get new equipment?
But their daily lives didn't get better. Access to food, water, healthcare, a fair hearing in court, those things often stagnated or got worse. And that alienation, that disconnect, it just deepened the instability the military forces were supposedly there to fix.
So the key takeaway from this section is that the way the problem was framed led to solutions that didn't address the real roots and might have even made the foundations weaker.
That's the core argument. The military focus bypassed the need to build genuine state legitimacy, the kind of legitimacy that ultimately makes insurgency less appealing in the first place.
Okay, let's pivot then to the major external actor here, France. Starting around 2013, with the crisis unfolding in Mali, France launched Operation Serval, which then evolved into the larger region-wide Operation Barkhane.
Yes, these were massive, long-term military commitments, and the stated goal was clear: stop the spread of jihadist groups and help stabilize these countries.
And we should acknowledge, shouldn't we, that initially, especially Serval, there were some successes.
Oh, definitely. Tactically, in the short term, they achieved significant gains. They pushed insurgents out of major northern Malian towns, disrupted command structures, at least for a while.
But the source argues this is where the paradox comes in, the paradox of short-term success.
Exactly. That immediate military win masked a much more insidious long-term failure.
Which was
the entrenchment of what the source calls a politics of dependence. Those tactical victories, instead of creating space for Sahelian states to build their own capacity, they actually encouraged a reliance on external security guarantees. Why build up your own struggling army, reform your corrupt institutions, or take difficult political steps if France essentially had your back militarily?
So the safety net kind of removed the incentive for self-reliance.
In many ways, yes. The states didn't have to get fundamentally stronger or more legitimate because an external power was underwriting their survival, at least against the major insurgent threats.
Is there actual evidence for this? Does the research show that relying on foreign troops makes host governments weaker or less accountable?
Yes, it does. The source material cites empirical studies suggesting a direct correlation. States in the Sahel that relied heavily on external military forces tended to show two things. First, significantly weaker domestic accountability to their own citizens. And second, relatedly, slower institutional growth. Their state structures just didn't develop or reform as quickly. It's sometimes called the dependence effect.
That makes a certain kind of political logic, doesn't it? If you're an elite in power in, say, Bamako, and your primary security guarantor is in Paris, not your own population.
then the pressure to actually deliver for your citizens, to tackle corruption, to build trust, is significantly reduced. You're less accountable downwards to your people and more accountable upwards or outwards to your foreign partners.
So the foreign military presence almost acts like a shield, insulating the government from popular pressure for reform.
Precisely. It can externally legitimize the ruling elite. They're seen as partners in the fight against terror while simultaneously allowing them to sideline internal critics. Think civil society groups, opposition figures, local leaders who might be pushing for better governance. Their voices get drowned out.
The connection between the state and its own society gets weaker.
It gets severed, or at least badly frayed.
And this, the source argues, leads to the ultimate paradox regarding sovereignty. The intervention claims it's there to protect the state's sovereignty.
But by fostering this deep dependency, it actually hollows out that sovereignty from within. It makes the state less capable of standing on its own 2 feet.
So what happens when the external force leaves? Or, as we've seen, gets kicked out?
The governance vacuum doesn't just reappear. The argument is it often comes back worse than before.
Worse. Why worse?
Because the state hasn't used the intervening years to build its own legitimacy or capacity. It's potentially weaker relative to the challenges than it was before the intervention started. And now the external prop is gone, leaving behind a population that's likely even more alienated and angry.
And we literally watched this play out across the region. The coups we mentioned earlier, Mali in 2020 and 2021, Burkina Faso in 2022, Niger in 2023, these weren't isolated incidents.
No, the source frames them as direct consequences, visible manifestations of this widespread disillusionment. It wasn't just military plotters. It reflected a feeling among parts of the military and the public that years of foreign intervention hadn't delivered real security or progress for ordinary people.
Just propped up elites in the capital.
That was the perception. Elites benefited, corruption continued, while insecurity maybe even spread in rural areas. The system wasn't working.
And those huge anti-French protests that accompanied the coup, they were really striking.
Extremely striking. They signaled this broad public rejection of what was widely perceived as a kind of neo-colonial relationship.
A feeling that France was prioritizing its own strategic interests, maybe counterterrorism goals, maybe economic access, maybe just maintaining influence.
Over the actual well-being and security of the people living in the Sahel. That perception became incredibly powerful.
Okay, let's dig a bit deeper into that critique. The source seems to hit the intervention on 2 fronts. One is normative, it eroded sovereignty, self-determination, and the other is empirical. It just didn't work. Even on its own terms, the military-first approach failed to deliver stability. Is that fair?
That's a very fair summary. Empirically, the data points towards a pretty significant failure. And we're not talking about, minor shortcomings. We're talking about a systemic inability to produce lasting, measurable improvements in governance or security.
Does the source cite specific evidence for that?
It does. It references, for example, a key finding from the International Crisis Group, the ICG, back in 2022. They did extensive tracking of stability trends across the region.
And what did the ICG find that was so critical?
Their research was quite damning, actually. It showed a consistent pattern. Areas that had a prolonged foreign military presence, especially areas near the main operational hubs, those areas did not show significant sustained improvements in things like the rule of law or the quality of basic government services or even just basic civic trust in the state.
So no real governance dividend from the security presence.
In many cases, the metrics actually showed things getting worse, not better. Having foreign boots on the ground simply didn't translate into building a more functional, legitimate local state.
Wow, so billions spent, major military efforts, but the underlying conditions didn't improve. And we know the violence didn't go away, did it?
No, it shifted, it mutated. The military pressure, say in northern Mali, it did scatter some of the main jihadist groups initially, but those groups didn't just disappear. They adapted, they moved, they exploited the governance weaknesses elsewhere.
So the insecurity spread.
It metastasized, exactly. The conflict's center of gravity shifted south into central Mali and then spilled across borders into that volatile tri-border area, the Liptako-Gourma region, linking Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger.
So the military success was temporary and localized, but the failure, the spread of instability, was regional and more lasting.
That's the picture the analysis paints, which points directly to what the source sees as the core strategic mistake.
Which one?
Treating the insurgency almost exclusively as a military problem. seeing it as just an enemy force to be degraded or destroyed using military means.
Rather than understanding the political and social roots.
Exactly. They largely neglected the deep sociopolitical grievances that act as the real recruitment engine for these groups. Things like perceived injustice, state corruption, marginalization of certain communities, lack of economic opportunity.
And if your military operations don't address those grievances, or worse, if they create new grievances,
like through civilian casualties or heavy-handed tactics,
then you risk creating more enemies than you defeat.
That's precisely the argument. Military action divorced from a political strategy that addresses root causes can become counterproductive. It can fuel the very insurgency it's trying to suppress.
And this connects back to the point about local communities. The failure to really integrate community-level peace building.
Yes, the reliance on top-down, often foreign-led military solutions tended to completely bypass or even undermine local structures. Think village elders, religious figures, traditional chiefs, the people who often hold the keys to local reconciliation and dispute resolution.
If peace is dictated by soldiers, it doesn't necessarily stick at the grassroots level.
It often doesn't. It lacks local ownership and legitimacy.
Okay, so this whole dynamic, the dependency, the empirical failure, the focus on military over political solutions, feeds into that deeper critique you mentioned.
Yeah.
The neo-colonial continuum.
Right. This is a more structural argument, drawing on post-colonial theory.
What's the essence of it?
It posits that France's role, even after formal independence, maintained patterns of dominance that resembled the colonial era. Through things like economic leverage, its network of military bases, a significant political influence, Paris was able to essentially subordinate the agency and interests of these Sahelian states to its own strategic priorities.
Can you make that more concrete? What specific economic or military ties does the source point to as examples of this perceived control?
Well, economically, things like the persistence of the CFA franc currency zone are often cited by critics as mechanisms that limit true monetary sovereignty for these nations.
Okay.
Militarily, the basing agreements that allowed French forces broad operational freedom were often seen locally not just as security cooperation, but as symbols of continued French dominance and influence over national security decisions.
So for many people in the Sahel, this constellation of factors, the economic ties, the military footprint, the political sway, it just didn't feel like true independence.
It felt like a continuation of unequal power relations where African self-determination was secondary to French interests. That's the core of the neocolonial critique.
And this simmering resentment, this structural dissatisfaction, eventually boiled over to the dramatic geopolitical shift we've witnessed recently.
Absolutely. The formation of the Alliance of Sahel States, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger acting in concert is a direct result. It's a coordinated pushback.
A rejection of that old dependency model.
Explicitly. Marked most clearly by the expulsion of French troops from all three countries. And of course, the simultaneous pivot towards new security partners.
Notably Russia and associated groups like Wagner, now rebranded.
Yes. It signals a profound desire to break free from that perceived French sphere of influence.
But here's the critical question, and the source touches on this too, right? If the alliance just swaps France for Russia as its main external security backer, is that really reclaiming sovereignty? Or just changing patrons?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the source material is very clear on this. True sovereignty isn't just about who your foreign partners are. It's not just about kicking out one power.
It has to be rooted internally.
It requires fundamental internal legitimacy. Legitimacy that comes from accountable government, inclusive politics, and delivering for your own people. If these new alliances just become a different flavor of external dependence without tackling the rot within the corruption, the weak institutions, the divisions,
Then the instability continues.
then the core problems, the governance vacuum, the potential for conflict, they absolutely persist. This new autonomy has to be used to drive deep domestic reform. Otherwise, it's just rearranging the deck chairs.
Let's talk about the costs. Because this focus on militarized security didn't just fail strategically, it came at a huge developmental cost, didn't it?
Immense costs. We're talking about devastating opportunity costs. When so much national resource and international aid gets channeled into the security sector, other vital areas get starved.
And in the Sahel, the vast majority of people depend on.
Over 70% of the population relies directly on agriculture and pastoralism. Farming, raising livestock, that's their livelihood.
So when the national budget, or the aid money, prioritizes fighter jets or foreign military salaries or surveillance gear.
That's money not being spent on things that directly support those livelihoods. Irrigation projects, better seeds, rural health care, roads to get goods to market.
And organizations like the UNDP have pointed this out, right? That this creates a vicious cycle.
It absolutely does. Neglecting rural development fuels poverty and marginalization. That poverty and lack of opportunity make people more vulnerable to recruitment by extremist groups who might offer protection or money or a sense of justice.
Which then justifies even more security spending to fight the insurgents.
Exactly, locking the region into this downward spiral of insecurity, poverty, and dependence.
And what seems especially maddening, reading the analysis, is the apparent failure to connect the dots. The source talks about a real fragmentation of efforts.
Yeah, this is a critical point. You have these externally funded security programs operating in one silo.
Focused on kinetic operations, fighting.
Right. And then often completely separately, you might have climate adaptation projects or rural development aid running in another silo, maybe funded by different donors, run by different ministries.
With little or no coordination.
Often very little. There's no synergy. One hand isn't talking to the other.
Right.
You might have soldiers clearing an area, but no follow-up plan to address the land disputes or water shortages that caused the conflict there in the first place.
The Sahel and West Africa Club, SWAC, they argued pretty strongly against this fragmentation, didn't they?
They did. Their analysis basically says sustainable peace is structurally impossible under this fragmented model. You have to integrate the different strands.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning environmental governance, securing livelihoods, and preventing conflict need to be part of a single, unified strategy. Security operations need to be planned with development goals in mind, and vice versa. That integrated approach has been largely absent.
Okay, so given these failures of the external, fragmented, militarized approach, it's no surprise there are growing calls for African-led solutions.
Massive calls. Solutions rooted in regional cooperation and a deeper understanding of the local context.
And the structures for this kind of regional cooperation, they technically exist already.
They do. You have the African Union's Peace and Security Architecture, APSA. It's designed for continent-wide collective security and conflict resolution.
And regionally.
You have ECOS, the Economic Community of West African States, obviously very relevant geographically.
So if these bodies exist, why have they often seemed sidelined or ineffective in the Sahel crisis compared to, say, France or the UN?
Well, the source points to two main reasons, typically. First, persistent resource constraints. Money and operational capacity. APSA and ECOS often lack the independent funding and logistical muscle to mount major, sustained interventions without relying on external donors.
And those external donors often come with strings attached. Back to the dependency issue.
Exactly, which limits the autonomy of these African-led initiatives. The second major hurdle is political division among the member states themselves.
National interest trumping regional solidarity.
Often, yes. Disagreements between governments, concerns about sovereignty, sometimes leaders prioritizing their own stability over collective action. These political rifts can paralyze effective regional responses.
So making these bodies truly effective means more than just statements. It needs real cash and real political will to put the region first.
Absolutely. Genuine financial independence and a shared strategic vision are key.
And it's not just about the high-level regional bodies, is it? The source stresses the local level, too.
Hugely important. We need to talk about the power of grassroots, community-based initiatives, things like traditional dispute resolution mechanisms, local peace committees involving elders, women, youth.
The very things that the top-down militarization tended to ignore or erode.
Precisely. These are the engines of social resilience. They're often far better placed to manage local land disputes or address grievances peacefully than a distant state or a foreign army.
So supporting these local structures is crucial for actually rebuilding the social fabric.
It's fundamental. And the source emphasizes this support needs to be inclusive, particularly recognizing the vital role women often play in community peacebuilding, a role that's frequently overlooked in formal processes. If you don't strengthen the foundations at the community level, any regional or international efforts are built on shaky ground.
Okay, let's bring this toward solutions and policy implications. Given everything we've discussed, the climate stress, the dependency trap, the failure of militarization, what's the big shift needed from policymakers?
The core message from the source material is a fundamental pivot. Move away from just managing crises, reacting to outbreaks of violence.
Towards what?
Towards a long-term developmental approach. one that puts governance, social equity, and environmental sustainability right at the center.
So a total reframing of priorities for everyone involved, civilian governments and their international partners.
Exactly. And the research fellow, Akanbi, boils this down into 3 really clear, actionable policy recommendations. These define a path towards what he calls strategic autonomy.
Okay. Recommendation number 1.
Rebalance foreign assistance drastically. This means shifting the focus away from pouring money into military hardware, tactical training, counterinsurgency kit,
And redirecting it towards.
towards the foundations of a stable society. Governance reform, strengthening the justice system, supporting local peace initiatives, and crucially, investing directly in livelihoods, climate-resilient agriculture, water management, basic services. Build legitimacy from the bottom up.
That sounds sensible, but it also sounds politically really difficult. You've got vested interests, defense industries, security establishments, maybe even local elites who benefit from security aid.
Yeah.
How do you actually make that shift happen?
It requires real political will and accountability. The source suggests, for instance, that international partners need to get serious about conditionality, tying aid not just to security cooperation, but to measurable progress on things like fighting corruption, improving human rights, delivering services.
So proving you're reforming internally.
Yes. And equally, the Sahelian states themselves, especially this new alliance, need to demonstrate to their partners, old or new, that they prioritize these governance and development sectors. They need to ensure aid aligns with their own stated goals of self-reliance and popular well-being.
Okay. Recommendation number 2.
Support genuinely African-led mechanisms. Give bodies like the African Union and ECOWAS the resources and the political space they need to lead.
Put them in the driver's seat for regional security and governance.
Exactly. Provide them with predictable, independent funding so they're not reliant on external donors with their own agendas. And crucially, the member states themselves need to commit financially and politically to making these regional bodies work. That's vital for achieving that strategic autonomy we talked about, the ability to set their own course.
And the third recommendation circles back to the very beginning of our conversation.
Yes, institutionalize environmental peacebuilding. Formally recognize that climate change adaptation and conflict prevention are 2 sides of the same coin. They cannot be treated separately.
How do you institutionalize that?
It means creating structures, maybe dedicated government departments, maybe regional task forces that explicitly integrate climate policy with security strategy. You need your environmental scientists talking to your military planners, your agricultural experts working with your conflict mediators.
So, for instance, planning where water resources will be scarce becomes part of preventing future conflict.
Precisely. Managing land use becomes a core part of security strategy, not just an environmental issue. It's about proactively addressing the resource conflicts before they escalate and provide openings for extremists.
So looking back, the argument is the previous model failed, not because not enough money was spent, but because it fundamentally misdiagnosed the problem and applied the wrong solutions.
That's the essence of it. An external, militarized solution was imposed on what was, at its heart, an internal crisis driven by governance failures, social inequity, and profound environmental stress. And those external solutions often ended up serving external interests more than local needs.
So wrapping this all up, what we've really explored today is how the Sahel's ongoing crisis is almost a textbook case of the challenges of post-colonial sovereignty in our interconnected world.
Absolutely. External interventions, however well-intentioned some might claim they were, ultimately created and reinforced dependency, weakened state capacity, and sidelined local voices and local solutions.
And the path forward, according to the source material we've been discussing, isn't about cutting ties with the world entirely. It's not isolationism.
No, it's about reclaiming strategic autonomy. And that autonomy has to be built on solid foundations. Real regional cooperation between African states, serious institutional reform within those states, and a development model that genuinely prioritizes the needs and equity of ordinary people.
The core lesson seems to be that lasting security can't be imported or imposed from outside.
It has to be homegrown. Anchored in self-determination, yes, but crucially also in deep, often difficult governance reform.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, our listeners, to consider. We've established, based on this analysis, that true sovereignty, true self-determination, requires internal legitimacy and state accountability just as much, if not more, than simply being independent from external powers. The new Alliance of Sahel States Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, they've made a decisive break. They've expelled French forces, rejected that old security paradigm. That was a major diplomatic and military move.
A huge shift.
But now comes the hard part, perhaps. Given the immense internal challenges they still face, we're talking deep-seated corruption, elite capture of resources, historical political divisions, the ongoing violence. What immediate non-military steps must this new alliance take?
How do they prove to their own citizens, especially those in marginalized rural areas who've suffered the most, that this isn't just swapping one foreign partner for another?
Right. How do they demonstrate, quickly and convincingly, that they've truly chosen a path of internal renewal, of self-determination that benefits the people?
How will they use this hard-won geopolitical space to deliver tangible improvements, real justice, transparent governance, basic services to those communities that have felt abandoned for so long?
That demonstration of genuine internal legitimacy, that building of trust from within, that seems like the ultimate test of this new chapter for the Sahel.
It really is. It's the question that will likely shape the region's trajectory for years to come.
A critical question indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.